Ronald Exantis. In February 2024, Ronald Exantis walked out of a Kentucky prison after serving just 10 years of a 20-year sentence. The former nurse had been convicted in the 2015 ending of 6-year-old Logan Tipton in what would become one of Kentucky's most controversial early releases. On December 7, 2015, Exantis broke into the Tipton family home in Versailles while they slept. The nurse entered through an unlocked door and made his way upstairs where the family was resting. Using a kitchen knife, Exantis attacked Logan, causing fatal injuries. When Logan's father and sister tried to intervene, Exantis harmed them as well before fleeing the scene. How did investigators find him? Exantis crashed his vehicle nearby shortly after leaving the home, where police quickly apprehended him. Arrest footage showed Exantis appearing disoriented and confused, exhibiting behavior that would become central to his defense strategy. What was his defense? During his 2018 trial, Exantis claimed he was experiencing a psychotic episode at the time of the attack. He testified that he heard voices commanding him to act, attributing this to undiagnosed mental illness. Exantis said stress from his nursing job and family difficulties had exacerbated his mental state, creating conditions for the psychotic break. His defense team argued he should not be held fully responsible due to his mental condition. The jury found Exantis not guilty of the primary charge by reason of insanity, accepting his mental health defense to some degree. However, they convicted him on related charges and he received a 20-year sentence. How did early release happen? Exantis was released under Kentucky's mandatory reentry supervision program after accumulating good behavior credits during his incarceration. He had served approximately half of his sentence when the credits made him eligible. The release shocked Logan's family and the community, who felt 10 years was insufficient for taking a young life. Logan's mother, Heather Tipton, stated, "It's wholly unacceptable for someone who ended my son's life to walk free after just several years in prison." The family had prepared victim impact statements over the years, detailing the ongoing trauma of losing Logan. His sister, who had been harmed while trying to protect her brother, continued to deal with both physical and psychological scars from that December night. The sudden news of Exantis' release reopened wounds that had never fully healed. Community members who remembered the case expressed disbelief that someone convicted in such a case could be released after serving only half his sentence. Local news coverage of the release sparked renewed attention to Kentucky's good behavior credit system and whether it was being applied appropriately in serious cases. What happened after release? Just days after walking free, Exantis was arrested in Florida in March 2024 for failing to register as required under his release conditions. He had failed to register as a convicted felon as mandated, violating the terms of his supervision. Florida authorities detained Exantis and he was extradited back to Kentucky to face consequences for the violation. His parole was formally revoked in April 2024 after he failed to register as a sex offender/felon in Florida. What broader impact did this have? The case prompted calls for Kentucky prison reform and changes to how early release is calculated. Critics argued that good behavior credits should not apply to those convicted of ending lives, regardless of their conduct while incarcerated. Members of the Kentucky Parole Board received threats following Exantis' release, highlighting the intense public anger over the decision. The threats led to increased security measures for board members. During court proceedings, Exantis had expressed that he needed institutional care rather than standard imprisonment. He acknowledged his actions while maintaining they resulted from mental illness beyond his control. The Tipton family advocated strongly for changes to prevent similar early releases in the future. They argued that the trauma of losing Logan was compounded by seeing his convicted attacker freed after such a short time. As of 2026, Exantis remains in custody serving the remainder of his 20-year sentence. with his parole revocation ensuring he will not be eligible for early release again. His brief freedom highlighted gaps in Kentucky's criminal justice system regarding supervision of released individuals. The case raised important questions about balancing mental health considerations in criminal cases with appropriate accountability for serious crimes. While Exantus's mental state played a role in his defense, critics argued that the impact on victims and their families should weigh more heavily in release decisions. Clerical errors would also play a role in another controversial 2025 release. Jonathan Santillan. In January 2024, Jonathan Santillan walked out of North Carolina prison due to an employee error despite being sentenced to life without parole. Within weeks of his erroneous release, he was recaptured by a task force 3 days later. Santillan had been convicted for the 2013 gang-related endings of Samuel Flores Mendoza and Maria Saravia, Mendoza in Garner. The couple had been targeted in what prosecutors described as a case of mistaken identity. What happened in the 2013 case? Santillan and accomplices invaded the Mendoza home believing the residents were connected to a rival gang. When they discovered their error, they proceeded with the attack anyway. The couple was shot execution style inside their own home, a brutal crime that shocked the Garner community. The nature of the attack demonstrated the cold-blooded approach of those involved. Gang retaliation motivated the crime, though Santillan had been a teenager at the time and later claimed limited involvement. The feud between gang factions had led to the targeting of the wrong individuals. How was Santillan caught initially? Police investigation linked Santillan to the scene through witness statements from people who had information about the attack. Physical evidence from the home also connected him to the crimes. In 2015, Santillan was convicted and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, reflecting the severity of the double ending. The sentence meant he was supposed to spend the rest of his life behind bars. His appeals questioned aspects of his confession, but the conviction stood. Legal challenges to his sentence had been unsuccessful for years before the erroneous release. What caused the mistaken release? An employee at the North Carolina Department of Correction made an error that resulted in Santillan being processed for release in May 2025. The specific nature of the mistake was not fully detailed publicly. This administrative failure allowed someone sentenced to life without parole to simply walk out, representing a catastrophic breakdown in procedures meant to prevent exactly this scenario. The error went undetected until after Santillan had already left custody. What did he do after being mistakenly freed? Shortly after his release, Santillan was involved in a new shooting incident that brought him back into law enforcement's crosshairs. The details suggested he had immediately returned to dangerous behavior. He was charged with shooting at an officer in Wake County, escalating the seriousness of his post-release crimes. This attack on law enforcement compounded the already grave consequences of the erroneous release. Authorities quickly apprehended Santillan after the shooting incident, returning him to custody. The rapid reoffending validated concerns about releasing dangerous individuals prematurely. How did victims' families react? The Mendoza family expressed outrage upon learning that the man convicted of ending their loved ones had been mistakenly freed. The pain of losing Samuel and Maria was reopened by the news of Santillan walking free. While specific quotes from family members were not widely reported, the case raised serious concerns about systemic failures in the corrections system. The fact that such an error could occur with someone serving life without parole was particularly alarming. What systemic issues does this reveal? The case highlighted problems with documentation and verification processes within the Department of Correction. How someone sentenced to life without parole could be released through clerical error suggested inadequate safeguards. The immediate reoffending after mistaken release demonstrated the danger posed when violent individuals are freed before they should be. Santillan's actions proved he remained a threat to public safety. Training and oversight procedures came under scrutiny as officials tried to understand how the error occurred and prevent future incidents. The shooting of an officer while Santillan was erroneously free added urgency to the review process. What is his current status? As of 2026, Santillan remains in custody, facing both his original life sentence and new charges from the incident that occurred during his mistaken release. The new shooting charge added to his already lengthy sentence. The Department of Correction implemented additional verification steps to prevent similar errors, though critics argued these measures should have been in place all along. The Santillan case became a cautionary tale about the consequences of administrative failures in the criminal justice system. Another administrative error would have equally dangerous consequences in Georgia. Cathan Guzman. In January 2025, Cathan Guzman walked out of Clayton County Jail in Georgia due to a paperwork error, despite having been sentenced to life without parole just months earlier. Guzman had been convicted of ending the life of his 19-year-old girlfriend, making his mistaken release particularly alarming. In 2022, Guzman and his girlfriend Delilah Grayson had gotten into an argument at their Georgia residence. The dispute escalated beyond words into physical confrontation. During the argument, Guzman strangled Grayson, causing her passing. The method indicated sustained action rather than a momentary loss of control, suggesting deliberate intent despite claims otherwise. Guzman confessed to police after the incident, admitting to causing Grayson's passing during the argument. He attributed his actions to rage, though this explanation did little to mitigate the severity of what he had done. The confession came after investigators confronted Guzman with evidence from the scene. His admission of guilt meant the case would proceed without need for extensive investigation, though determining appropriate sentencing would still require court proceedings. The confession detailed the escalation from verbal argument to physical confrontation to fatal ending. Grayson's family attended court proceedings, providing victim impact statements that described the vibrant young woman whose life was cut short. At just 19 years old, she had been planning her future when the argument with Guzman turned deadly. Friends and family remembered her as kind and full of potential. What was the legal outcome? In October 2024, Guzman was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, reflecting the deliberate nature of the ending. The sentence meant he would spend the rest of his life behind bars for taking Grayson's life. Just 5 months after sentencing, a paperwork error at Clayton County Jail resulted in Guzman being processed for release. The administrative failure allowed someone who should never have been freed to walk out of custody. The error went undetected until after Guzman had already left the facility, giving him time to leave Georgia before authorities realized what had happened. This delay complicated efforts to locate and recapture him. How did the victim's family react? Delilah Grayson's mother said she was petrified upon learning her daughter's convicted killer had been mistakenly released. The fear that Guzman might try to contact or harm family members was immediate and overwhelming. The mistaken release violated Georgia's Marsy's law, which guarantees crime victims certain rights, including notification about custody status changes. The family should have been informed if Guzman's status changed, let alone if he was being released. The violation of these victim rights compounded the trauma Grayson's family experienced. Not only was the person who ended their daughter's life mistakenly freed, but they weren't even notified it had happened. Where did Guzman go? After walking out of Clayton County Jail, Guzman fled to Florida, putting distance between himself and Georgia authorities. His choice to leave the state suggested awareness that his release was erroneous. U.S. Marshals tracked Guzman's movements as they worked to locate him in Florida. The multi-state manhunt required coordination between Georgia and Florida law enforcement agencies. On January 31, 2025, U.S. Marshals captured Guzman in Florida approximately 2 weeks after his mistaken release. The apprehension ended the immediate danger he posed to Grayson's family and the public. What consequences followed? Guzman was returned to Georgia custody to serve his life sentence without parole. Additional charges related to his escape status may have been considered, though the release was officially categorized as a mistake rather than an escape. Clayton County Jail faced scrutiny over how such a significant error could occur. The release of someone sentenced to life without parole due to paperwork problems suggested serious deficiencies in record-keeping and verification procedures. Officials promised reviews of protocols to prevent similar incidents in the future. However, the Guzman case joined a growing list of 2025 mistaken releases that raised questions about systemic problems across multiple jurisdictions. What systemic issues emerged? The case highlighted how paperwork errors can have catastrophic consequences when safeguards fail to catch them before release occurs. Multiple staff members should have been involved in verifying Guzman's status before he walked out. The violation of Marsy's law added another dimension to the failures, showing how victims and their families can be left vulnerable when systems break down. The law exists specifically to protect victims' rights, yet those protections proved meaningless when basic procedures weren't followed. As of 2026, Guzman remains in custody serving his life sentence, with his brief freedom serving as a stark reminder of the human cost of administrative errors. Grayson's family continues to advocate for reforms that would prevent similar mistakes. While these cases involved administrative errors, another 2025 release would be deliberate despite controversy. Mark Lundy. On May 7, 2025, Mark Lundy was released on parole in New Zealand after serving 23 years for the 2000 axe attacks that ended the lives of his wife, Christine, and daughter, Amber. Lundy has maintained his innocence throughout his incarceration, making his release particularly controversial. Born in 1958, Lundy worked as a traveling salesman and had been married to Christine for 17 years when tragedy struck. The couple had significant financial problems stemming from a failed vineyard investment that left them approximately $2 million in debt. What happened in August 2000? On August 29, 2000, Christine and Amber Lundy were found deceased in their Palmerston North home. Both had been attacked with what forensic experts determined was an axe or similar heavy weapon. Prosecutors argued that financial motive drove Lundy to end his family's lives, as he sought insurance payouts to cover the massive debts. They theorized Christine was the primary target, and Amber was ended as a witness. What evidence linked Lundy to the crimes? The most controversial piece of evidence was brain tissue allegedly found on Lundy's shirt. Forensic experts testified this tissue matched Christine's DNA and could only have gotten on the shirt during the attack. However, this evidence has been heavily disputed throughout Lundy's legal battles. Defense experts questioned whether the substance was actually brain tissue and how it could have survived being laundered. Other potentially crucial evidence, including hairs and DNA samples, were never tested, leading to ongoing questions about whether all investigative avenues were pursued. These untested materials became central to arguments about Lundy's possible innocence. Timeline evidence placed Lundy away from the home during the estimated time of the attacks, creating complications for the prosecution's theory. However, forensic analysis of his movements and the attack timing remained contested. What was his legal journey? Lundy was first convicted in 2002 and sentenced to life with a 20-year minimum. This conviction stood for over a decade before being overturned on appeal. A retrial was ordered, and in 2015, Lundy was convicted again and received the same sentence, life with a minimum of 20 years. The second jury heard updated forensic testimony but reached the same conclusion as the first. The retrial brought new expert witnesses who debated the science behind the brain tissue evidence. Defense experts challenged whether the substance on the shirt was actually brain tissue or could have been contamination from other sources. Prosecution experts maintained their analysis was sound, and the tissue definitively placed Lundy at the scene during the attacks. Both trials examined Lundy's alibi in detail. He claimed to have been traveling on business at the time of the attacks, but prosecutors argued the timeline allowed him to drive home, commit the crimes, and return to establish his alibi. Phone records and witness accounts were scrutinized to determine whether his movements matched his story. Throughout both trials and appeals, Lundy maintained his innocence, insisting that an intruder had ended his family's lives. He told authorities, "It's difficult to do a safety plan for something I haven't done," when asked about preventing future offending. What happened with parole? Lundy's first parole bid was denied, with the board determining he needed more time in custody. His continued insistence on innocence complicated rehabilitation assessments since he refused to take responsibility. Psychological evaluations assessed Lundy as having low reoffending risk, noting that any issues with substances had been treated during his incarceration. These assessments weighed in favor of eventual release. On May 7, 2025, after 23 years behind bars, Lundy was granted parole. The release came with strict conditions including curfews and supervision. What were his release conditions? Initially, Lundy faced significant restrictions on his movements and activities. He was required to report regularly to parole officers and maintain approved residence. A media ban prevented Lundy from speaking publicly about his case, though this condition was later relaxed. In December 2025, the media ban was lifted after Lundy demonstrated full compliance with other parole requirements. Lundy stated he was expanding social contacts as he adjusted to life outside prison after more than 2 decades in custody. The process of reintegrating into society after such a long absence presented numerous challenges. Is his case still being reviewed? As of 2026, the Criminal Cases Review Commission is investigating Lundy's case for potential miscarriage of justice. The investigation examines the contested forensic evidence and untested materials that could potentially exonerate him. Supporters argue the brain tissue evidence was scientifically unsound and that other suspects were never adequately investigated. Critics maintain that 2 separate juries heard the evidence and reached the same conclusion about his guilt. Lundy remains on parole with ongoing supervision, living under conditions designed to monitor his activities and ensure public safety. His case continues to divide opinion in New Zealand between those who believe him wrongly convicted and those confident in his guilt. The Lundy case represents the complex intersection of disputed forensic science, financial motive, and claims of innocence that persist despite multiple convictions. Whether he actually ended his family's lives or was wrongly imprisoned for 23 years remains a question that may never be definitively answered. From disputed forensic evidence, we turn to a case with a clear confession and known motive. Devendra Broussard. On June 2023, Devendra Broussard was released on parole from California prison after serving 17 years for the 2007 ending of Oakland journalist Chauncey Bailey. Broussard had been just 19 years old when he shot Bailey on orders from Yusuf Bey IV, leader of Your Black Muslim Bakery. Broussard grew up in poverty in San Francisco's Bayview neighborhood, where financial struggles shaped his early life. His family was involved in dealing substances, exposing him to criminal activity from a young age. What led to the ending of a journalist? Chauncey Bailey was investigating Your Black Muslim Bakery and planning to publish a story exposing financial crimes and internal problems at the organization. Bailey worked for the Oakland Post and was known for his fearless reporting. Yusuf Bey IV ordered Bailey's ending to prevent the story from being published. The leader of the bakery viewed the journalist as a threat that needed to be eliminated before damaging information went public. Broussard's loyalty to Bey IV motivated his participation, with promises of training in financial crimes as a reward. The young man viewed Bey as a mentor figure despite the leader's criminal activities. How did the attack occur? On the morning of August 2nd, 2007, Broussard approached Bailey on an Oakland street as the journalist walked to work. Broussard shot Bailey multiple times at close range, ending his life in broad daylight. The brazen nature of the attack shocked Oakland and the journalism community nationwide. Bailey became a symbol of journalists who faced danger for pursuing important stories. The shooting occurred in full view of witnesses on a busy Oakland street during morning commute hours. The boldness of the daytime attack suggested either desperation to stop Bailey's reporting or confidence that the bakery's influence would prevent consequences. Surveillance cameras in the area captured footage that would later prove crucial in the investigation. Bailey had been editor of the Oakland Post and was well known in the community for his investigative work. His reporting had previously exposed corruption and criminal activity, earning him both respect and enemies. The bakery story would have been another in a long line of accountability journalism. Were there other victims? Broussard was also convicted in the ending of Odell Robertson, another crime connected to the bakery's activities. Michael Wills was another victim linked to the organization's violent activities. The multiple endings demonstrated that Bailey's death was part of a broader pattern of violence emanating from your black Muslim bakery under Bay's leadership. How was Broussard caught? Police raided the bakery on August 3, 2007, just one day after Bailey's ending. During the raid, officers recovered weapons and other evidence. Broussard was arrested during the bakery raid, though initially he denied involvement. He had attempted to dispose of the gun used in the shooting during the police operation. In a 2008 60 Minutes interview, Broussard denied being the shooter, maintaining his innocence despite evidence against him. However, he would later change his story. What was his legal outcome? Broussard eventually pleaded guilty to manslaughter in 2009 rather than face trial for first-degree ending. The plea deal came in exchange for his testimony against others involved in the bakery's criminal activities. He received a 25-year sentence for his role in ending Bailey's life and the other crimes. His cooperation with prosecutors in cases against Bay IV and others factored into the sentencing. During sentencing, Broussard expressed remorse. "I want the families to know I am sorry. Whether this represented genuine regret or strategic positioning remained debated." How did his release unfold? After 17 years in prison, Broussard was granted parole in June 2025. The parole board determined he had served sufficient time and posed acceptable risk for supervised release. Broussard relocated to Southern California as part of his parole conditions, required to stay away from Oakland and the Bay Area. This geographic restriction aimed to prevent contact with former associates. The journalism community expressed mixed reactions to his release. While some accepted that he had served substantial time and testified against others, many felt 17 years was insufficient for ending a journalist who was simply doing his job. What was Bailey's legacy? Chauncey Bailey's ending galvanized efforts to protect journalists and expose corruption. The Chauncey Bailey Project was created to continue his investigative work and ensure his death led to accountability. The case demonstrated the dangers faced by journalists who investigate powerful criminal organizations. Bailey's willingness to pursue the bakery story, despite potential risks, exemplified commitment to public service journalism. As of 2026, Broussard remains on parole in Southern California, living under supervision with restrictions on his activities and associations. His case continues to serve as a reminder of the price some pay for seeking truth. From a young man manipulated into crime, we turn to a decades-long pattern of predatory behavior. Kevin Coe. In 2025, Kevin Coe died in Washington state at age 78 after decades of incarceration and civil commitment. Known as the South Hill Rapist, Coe had terrorized women in Spokane during the late 1970s and early 1980s through a series of attacks that shocked the community. born February 2, 1947, Coe had changed his name from Frederick and worked as a radio announcer and real estate agent before his crimes were uncovered. His mother Ruth would later be convicted of plotting to hire a hitman, adding another dark chapter to the family story. What crimes was Coe convicted of? Between 1978 and 1981, Coe was linked to over 43 attacks on women in Spokane, primarily targeting women who were jogging or walking alone. His signature involved placing a gloved fist in victims' throats to prevent them from screaming. The attacks created widespread fear in Spokane's South Hill neighborhood, changing how women moved through their own community. Parks and jogging trails that had been frequented became places of fear. Women altered their routines dramatically, avoiding being alone outdoors and changing their exercise habits. The attacks typically occurred during daylight or early evening hours, making even supposedly safe times feel dangerous. Community groups organized to escort women and increase awareness. The South Hill neighborhood, previously considered one of Spokane's safer areas, saw property values affected as the attacks continued unsolved. Residents installed additional security measures and formed neighborhood watch programs in response to the ongoing threat. Coe was convicted of one attack in 1981, though investigators believed he was responsible for dozens more. The single conviction came despite evidence linking him to multiple crimes. How was he caught? Police used a tracking device to monitor Coe's movements, observing patterns that matched the timing and locations of attacks. Multiple victims identified him through police lineups and other identification procedures. In 2007, DNA evidence definitively linked Coe to attacks, providing scientific confirmation decades after the crimes. The DNA match validated what investigators and victims had known all along. What was his legal journey? Coe was first convicted in 1981, but that conviction was overturned on legal technicalities. He was retried and convicted again in 1984, resulting in a lengthy prison sentence. After serving his prison term, Coe was civilly committed in 2008 as a dangerous offender. This civil commitment kept him in custody beyond his criminal sentence based on assessments that he posed ongoing risk. Throughout his incarceration and commitment, Coe maintained "I did nothing wrong," refusing to accept responsibility for his crimes. This denial persisted despite overwhelming evidence including DNA matches. What led to his 2025 release? At age 78 and in declining health, authorities deemed Coe low risk for reoffending. His advanced age and medical conditions factored heavily into the risk assessment. Psychological evaluation showed a psychopathy score of 2.5.3, indicating significant antisocial and narcissistic traits. However, evaluators concluded his age and health reduced the practical danger he posed. How did victims react? During the release hearing, victims relived their trauma in court, with at least one woman sobbing as she described the lasting impact of Coe's attacks. Decades had passed, but the psychological wounds remained. The women who testified expressed fear and anger at the prospect of Coe being free, regardless of his age and health. For them, no amount of time could erase what he had done or make his release acceptable. Kevin Coe died of natural causes at the age of 77 on November 13, 2024, while still in the custody of the state at the Special Commitment Center. The announcement of Coe's passing brought mixed reactions. Some victims expressed relief that he could no longer pose any threat, while others felt cheated that he had experienced even brief freedom before passing. What was Coe's lasting impact? The South Hill attacks changed Spokane permanently, creating awareness about safety for women in public spaces. The community's response to the attacks influenced how police departments across the country handle investigations of similar crimes. As of his December 2025 passing, Coe had never expressed genuine remorse or accepted responsibility for the trauma he caused. His denial persisted until the end, leaving victims without the acknowledgement many sought. While Coe's brief release ended with his passing, another offender's conditional release continues under intense scrutiny. Christopher Hubbard. In early 2025, Christopher Hubbard was released to California's Antelope Valley despite intense community opposition, known as the pillowcase rapist. Hubbard admitted to over 40 attacks between 1971 and 1990, making him one of California's most notorious offenders. Hubbard's crimes involved using pillowcases to muffle victims, a disturbing signature that gave him his moniker. The attacks spanned nearly 2 decades across California, creating a long trail of trauma. What was Hubbard's criminal history? Hubbard was first convicted in 1973, beginning a cycle of incarceration, release, and reoffending that would continue for decades. He was convicted again in 1982 and 1990, demonstrating a pattern that raised serious questions about his capacity for change. In 1996, Hubbard was designated as a dangerous offender, a civil status that allowed his continued custody beyond criminal sentences. This designation reflected expert assessment that he posed ongoing danger. Hubbard had been conditionally released before, only to violate terms and return to custody. His track record suggested high risk of future violations or reoffending. Why was the 2025 release controversial? Los Angeles County District Attorney George Gascon opposed Hubbard's release, stating it showed blatant disregard for safety. Gascon's office argued that Hubbard's history made community placement inappropriate. The proposed release location in Antelope Valley sparked fierce opposition from residents who organized protests and petitions. Community members felt they were being asked to accept unacceptable risk. Palmdale city leaders expressed being appalled at the decision to place Hubbard in their community. Local officials argued that other options should have been explored before putting their residents at risk. Where exactly was he placed? Hubbard was released to live in the Antelope Valley community of Juniper Hills under strict supervision conditions. The specific location was disclosed to nearby residents as required by notification laws. The release came with extensive monitoring and restrictions designed to limit Hubbard's movements and activities. GPS tracking, curfews, and prohibited zones formed part of his supervision plan. How did the community react? Community meetings were held where residents expressed anger and fear about Hubbard being placed in their neighborhood. Many felt the restrictions, while extensive, were insufficient given his history of repeated offending. Despite opposition, the court determined that Hubbard met criteria for conditional release under California's Dangerous Offender Program. The legal standard focused on whether he could be safely managed in the community with appropriate supervision. What is his current status? As of 2026, Hubbard remains under conditional supervision in Antelope Valley, subject to extensive monitoring and restrictions. Any violation of conditions could result in immediate return to custody. His status as a mentally disordered offender means ongoing treatment is part of his supervision requirements. Mental health professionals regularly assess his progress and compliance. The community continues to monitor the situation closely, with residents remaining vigilant about Hubbard's presence. Law enforcement maintains heightened awareness given the history and community concerns. Hubbard's case represents the tension between legal requirements for conditional release and community safety concerns when someone has such an extensive criminal history. While supervised release is part of California's system for managing dangerous offenders, the practical application creates ongoing controversy and fear. The debate surrounding Hubbard's release reflects broader questions about how society manages individuals who have committed serious crimes repeatedly. His admission to over 40 attacks, spanning 2 decades, creates legitimate concern that supervision alone may prove insufficient. Victims' advocates point to Hubbard's pattern of violating previous release terms as evidence that he cannot be trusted in community settings. The pillowcase signature of his crimes demonstrates a level of planning and methodology that suggests calculated behavior rather than impulsive acts. Hubbert's designation as mentally disordered adds complexity to assessments of his danger level. Mental health treatment forms part of his supervision, though critics question whether treatment can address decades of predatory behavior. The Antelope Valley community's opposition highlighted how placement decisions for dangerous offenders affect real people who must live with the consequences. Residents felt their concerns were dismissed in favor of legal requirements that prioritized Hubbert's rights over their safety. As time passes since his March 2025 release, the situation remains tense. Each day without incident provides some reassurance. Yet the community knows that Hubbert's history suggests vigilance must never wane. The extensive monitoring represents society's attempt to balance his supervised freedom against public protection. If you've made it this far and enjoy deep dives into the most shocking criminal cases, hit that subscribe button and don't forget to press the bell icon. While supervised release continues in California, another case from Australia would spark even greater outrage. Rodney Thomas Clark. In April 2024, Rodney Thomas Clark was released on parole in Australia after serving 38 years for the 1987 murder of 9-year-old Deborah Keegan. Clark had been 21 years old when he broke into the Keegan family home in Western Sydney and committed crimes that would haunt the family for decades. On July 15, 1987, Clark entered the Keegan home uninvited while the family slept. He targeted young Deborah, committing horrific acts before ending her life by suffocation. The most traumatic aspect was that Deborah's sister Sarah was in the same bed during the attack, witnessing what happened to her sister. Sarah pretended to be asleep throughout the ordeal, terrified that Clark would harm her too if he knew she was awake. How was Clark caught? Clark was apprehended after committing a subsequent break-in, which led investigators to connect him to the Keegan case. The pattern of his behavior and evidence from both scenes linked him definitively to Deborah's ending. In his trial, Clark was found guilty and sentenced to life imprisonment, plus additional time for other offenses, totaling over 50 years. The judge described the crimes as among the most serious the court had encountered. For 17 years, parole boards consistently denied Clark's release, recognizing the severity of his crimes and the ongoing trauma to the victim's family. Each denial brought temporary relief to the Keegans, though they knew Clark would keep applying. What was Sarah's response? Sarah Keegan, now an adult, has been vocal about the lasting impact of that night. She told news outlets, "This changed everything for me," describing how witnessing her sister's ending shaped her entire life. Sarah attended parole hearings to oppose Clark's release, providing emotional testimony about the ongoing trauma and her family's need for justice. Her pleas for Clark to remain imprisoned were supported by thousands who signed petitions. In media interviews, Sarah described the night in vivid detail, explaining how she lay frozen in terror next to her sister, helpless to intervene. The guilt of surviving while Deborah didn't has weighed on her for nearly 40 years. What about Clark's behavior in prison? Assessments described Clark as showing zero remorse for his crimes, with experts calling him the definition of evil. His lack of acknowledgement or regret for what he did to Deborah troubled those evaluating his suitability for release. Despite this, in 2017, a preliminary recommendation suggested Clark be given the lowest security rating, which would have allowed him greater freedom within the prison system. This recommendation was met with public outcry. Approval for day release was granted at one point, then overturned after intense opposition from the Keegan family and community. The back-and-forth decisions created a cycle of hope and devastation for Sarah and her family. Why was he ultimately released? After 38 years in custody, parole authorities determined Clark had served sufficient time and could be managed under supervision in the community. The decision prioritized his legal right to parole consideration over the family's objections. The November 28, 2025 release came despite Sarah's pleas and a public petition with thousands of signatures calling for him to remain imprisoned for life. The decision devastated the Keegan family. What conditions govern his release? Clark is subject to strict parole conditions in New South Wales, including restrictions on his movements and prohibition from contact with the Keegan family. GPS monitoring and regular check-ins with parole officers form part of his supervision. He is forbidden from entering certain areas and must maintain approved residence. Any violation of these conditions could result in immediate return to custody, though critics argue this provides little comfort to a family still traumatized by what he did. What is the current status? As of 2026, Clark remains on parole in the community, living under supervision somewhere in New South Wales. The specific location is kept confidential for security reasons, though nearby residents are notified when dangerous offenders are placed in their areas. Sarah Keegan continues to speak out about her sister's case and advocate for stronger protections for victims' families in parole processes. She has become a voice for others who feel the system prioritizes offenders' rights over victims' trauma. The Keegan family's decades of dread, as one news program described it, demonstrates how a single night of terror can echo through generations. Deborah's ending not only took her life, but fundamentally altered Sarah's trajectory and the entire family's future. Clark's release after 38 years raised questions about whether any amount of time can constitute sufficient punishment for crimes against children. While the legal system has processes for determining parole eligibility, the emotional reality for victims' families tells a different story. The case remains a painful example of the gap between legal justice and emotional healing, where procedural requirements for release clash with a family's enduring need for safety and closure that can never truly be achieved. Another controversial UK case would involve an unusual motive and fierce family opposition. Christopher Farrow. In early 2024, the parole board recommended that Christopher Farrow be moved to an open prison in the UK, sparking outrage from the family of his victim. However, in April 2024, this recommendation was blocked, keeping Farrow in a closed facility where he remains as of 2026. Farrow, from Cookridge in Leeds, had worked as a printer and was described as balding with black or grey hair. He was father of 3 children when he committed the crime that would define his legacy. What crime did Farrow commit? In March 1994, Farrow broke into the home of 51-year-old Wendy Speaks in Wakefield. His motivation was a shoe fetish that drove him to target her, planning to steal from her shoe collection. Farrow tied Wendy with stockings and tights before harming her in multiple ways. He then stabbed her 11 times, ending her life in her own home. After ending Wendy's life, Farrow raided her shoe drawer, taking items as trophies from the scene. The bizarre motive combined with the brutality of the attack made the case particularly disturbing. How was he caught? Farrow evaded capture for 6 years after Wendy's ending, living freely while investigators worked to solve the case. The cold case seemed destined to remain unsolved until forensic advances changed everything. In 2000, advances in fingerprint technology allowed investigators to identify a print from the crime scene that hadn't been readable with earlier methods. The enhanced fingerprint definitively linked Farrow to Wendy's home. Farrow was arrested 6 years after the offense, finally facing justice for what he had done to Wendy. The fingerprint evidence proved crucial in securing his conviction. What happened at trial? In 2000, Farrow was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment with an 18-year minimum before parole eligibility. The sentence also included convictions for related offenses discovered during the investigation. Psychological assessments revealed Farrow had harmful interests involving stockings and shoes, with experts noting his difficulty maintaining appropriate relationships. These findings painted a picture of someone whose fixations had escalated to deadly violence. Evaluations also noted his interest in harmful activities, suggesting that his crimes against Wendy weren't isolated incidents, but rather manifestations of long-standing problematic patterns. The depth of his issues raised questions about rehabilitation prospects. What was the 2025 parole situation? Having served 25 years by 2025, Farrow became eligible for parole consideration. His legal team argued that his time served and behavior in prison warranted progression to an open facility as a step toward eventual release. The parole board initially recommended, in March 2025, that Farrow be moved to an open prison, a lower security facility where inmates have more freedom and can prepare for community reintegration. This recommendation suggested the board believed he posed manageable risk. Open prisons in the UK system serve as transitional environments where long-term inmates can demonstrate trustworthiness before full release. The recommendation implied that Farrow had made sufficient progress to warrant this step. How did Wendy's family react? Wendy's daughter Tracy expressed being shocked and appalled at the recommendation to move her mother's killer to an open prison. The family felt 25 years was insufficient given the nature of the crimes. Tracy and other family members provided statements to the parole board describing the lasting impact of Wendy's ending. The violent nature of the attack and the bizarre shoe fetish motive made the crime particularly difficult for the family to process even decades later. The family argued that Farrow's harmful interests and the calculated nature of his crime suggested he remained dangerous regardless of time served. They questioned whether someone with such deep-seated issues could truly be rehabilitated. What happened with the recommendation? In April 2025, just 1 month after the initial recommendation, the decision to move Farrow to an open prison was blocked. Additional review had determined that the move was premature given the nature of his crimes and assessments. The reversal came after public outcry and further evaluation of Farrow's risk factors. While he had been compliant in prison, experts concluded that his psychological profile warranted continued containment in a closed facility. The blocking of the move represented a victory for Wendy's family and those who believed Farrow should never be released. However, it wasn't a permanent decision. He could be reconsidered for open prison status in the future. What is his current status? As of 2026, Christopher Farrow remains in a closed prison facility serving his life sentence. He continues to be evaluated periodically for potential progression through the prison system. While Farrow's release was blocked, another Australian case would see a dangerous offender freed despite serious concerns. Stephen Neil White. In November 2024, Stephen Neil White was released from prison in Western Australia despite having recently breached parole conditions. The 59-year-old had a history of serious offenses, including attacks on vulnerable victims spanning decades. White's criminal history included attacking a 73-year-old woman in South Australia and other serious offenses that demonstrated a pattern of targeting vulnerable individuals. His record showed escalating violence over time. What were his most serious crimes? In 2001, White committed particularly heinous acts in Western Australia that would define his criminal legacy. He abducted a 5-year-old child and subjected her to horrific treatment before harming her with a rock. After the attack, White took the child to a hospital, a bizarre action that led to his apprehension. Medical staff recognized the nature of her injuries as inconsistent with White's explanation and contacted authorities. The crime barely made news at the time, lost among other stories despite its severity. The victim, now an adult, has spoken about surviving the attack and its lasting impact. What sentence did he receive? White was sentenced to 22 years in prison for his 2001 crimes, reflecting the serious nature of the offenses. Multiple supervision orders were put in place to govern his eventual release. However, White's path to freedom would be complicated by behavioral issues and violations while in custody and during previous release attempts. What happened with earlier release attempts? White was first released in 2023 after serving his sentence, subject to extensive supervision conditions. The release was controversial given his criminal history and risk assessments. However, in 2024, White's release was revoked after he committed a knife attack while supposedly under supervision. The violation demonstrated that even with monitoring, he posed ongoing danger. The 2024 breach led to his return to custody, where authorities had to reconsider whether he could ever be safely managed in the community. The knife incident raised serious questions about the adequacy of existing supervision measures. Why was he released again in 2025? Despite the 2024 breach, White was granted release again on May 30, 2025. This time with 67 different conditions governing his freedom. The extensive conditions reflected recognition of the high risk he posed. The supervision order extends through December 2026, meaning White must comply with all 67 conditions for over a year before any relaxation might be considered. The conditions include GPS monitoring, regular reporting, residence restrictions, and prohibitions on contact with certain populations. What mental health issues affect his case? White has been diagnosed with schizophrenia, intellectual disability, and brain injury, complicating assessments of his risk and responsibility. These conditions require ongoing treatment and medication compliance. Experts assessed White as having high reoffending risk without proper supervision, making the extensive conditions necessary to any community placement. His mental health challenges mean he requires both security supervision and treatment services. The intersection of serious mental illness with violent criminal history creates complex challenges for the justice and mental health systems. White needs therapeutic intervention, but also poses genuine danger if not properly managed. What support is in place? White is receiving approximately $800,000 in NDIS support to fund his supervision and care in the community. The substantial funding covers 24-hour monitoring, mental health treatment, and other services deemed necessary. The high cost of supervising White in the community sparked debate about whether such resources might be better allocated to prevention programs or victim services. However, proponents argue that proper supervision is essential to public safety if he is to be released at all. The NDIS funding allows for intensive support that imprisonment alone cannot provide, including mental health treatment and disability services tailored to White's specific needs. The goal is to address underlying issues that contribute to his dangerousness. What is his current status? As of 2026, Stephen Neil White remains in the Western Australia community under his 67-condition supervision order. He is subject to intensive monitoring and must comply with restrictions on virtually every aspect of his life. The extensive conditions and funding make White's case one of the most intensively supervised releases in Australian history. Every movement is tracked, every interaction monitored, and services coordinate to prevent reoffending. Critics argue that someone with White's history, including the 2024 knife attack during a previous supervised release, should never have been freed regardless of conditions. They question whether any amount of supervision can truly prevent someone with his patterns from reoffending. The adult survivor of his 2001 crime continues to advocate for stronger protections and questions whether her trauma should be reopened each time White appears for review or violates conditions. Her survival represents both resilience and the lifelong impact of his actions. From intensive Australian supervision to an Irish case where supervision failed entirely. Simon McGinley. In July 2024, Simon McGinley was released from Irish prison, despite being described as one of Ireland's most notorious offenders. Within weeks of release, McGinley vanished, prompting an international manhunt. McGinley, 52 years old at the time of release, had been convicted of shocking attacks that traumatized Ireland. His criminal history demonstrated a pattern of targeting the most vulnerable victims imaginable. What were McGinley's crimes? In 1997, McGinley attacked a 13-year-old girl, committing acts so serious they became known as the C case in Irish legal history. The case drew attention to inadequacies in how Ireland addressed such crimes at the time. In 2008, McGinley struck again, this time attacking an 85-year-old woman with dementia. The elderly victim was completely defenseless, making the crime particularly heinous. The attacks shocked the nation, with people struggling to comprehend how someone could target such vulnerable individuals. The age ranges of his victims, from 13 to 85, demonstrated that McGinley's predatory behavior knew no bounds. What were his sentences? For the 1997 attack, McGinley received 12 years in prison in 1998. The sentence reflected the seriousness with which Irish courts viewed the crime, though many felt it was insufficient. After serving that sentence, McGinley committed the 2008 attack on the elderly woman. In 2009, he received 21 years for this second offense, with the judge recognizing the extreme vulnerability of the victim. How did victims respond? One of McGinley's victims spoke to media about the impact of his crimes, stating that he had ruined her life. She described the 21-year sentence as a bit of relief, though no punishment could undo what he had done. The victim's courage in speaking to Arte in 2009 helped put a human face on the devastating impact of McGinley's actions. Her testimony emphasized that the trauma extended far beyond the physical acts themselves. The elderly victim from 2008 had dementia and was in a care facility when McGinley attacked her. Her vulnerability and inability to fully comprehend or communicate what happened made the crime even more unconscionable. What led to his 2025 release? Having served his sentences for both offenses, McGinley became eligible for release in 2025. Despite concerns about his history, Irish law required his freedom upon completion of his term. Gardaí, Irish police, were placed on high alert before his release, anticipating that he might pose continued danger. Officers prepared to monitor him closely given his history of targeting vulnerable individuals. McGinley reportedly boasted about his impending release while still in prison, showing no remorse for his crimes. His attitude suggested he viewed freedom as a victory rather than an opportunity for rehabilitation. What happened after release? McGinley was released on July 2, 2025, with conditions attached to monitor his activities. The conditions were designed to track his movements and limit his access to vulnerable populations. However, in August 2025, McGinley breached his release conditions and disappeared from supervision. Authorities lost track of his whereabouts, triggering an immediate response. An arrest warrant was issued for McGinley when he failed to report as required and could not be located at his registered address. The violation came barely a month after his release. Where did he go? Authorities believe McGinley fled to Scotland to evade Irish supervision and possible rearrest. The cross-border nature of his flight complicated efforts to locate and apprehend him. Gardaí coordinated with Scottish authorities to track McGinley's possible whereabouts. However, finding one person who doesn't want to be found across multiple jurisdictions presents significant challenges. Psychological assessments had described McGinley as a volatile predator, making his disappearance particularly concerning for public safety. His history suggested he would likely target vulnerable victims again if given opportunity. What is his current status? As of 2026, Simon McGinley remains at large with an active arrest warrant. His location is unknown, though authorities continue seeking information about his whereabouts. The case represents a failure of the release and supervision system, where someone with McGinley's dangerous history was able to simply vanish shortly after being freed. Questions arose about whether monitoring was adequate given the known risks. Community members in both Ireland and Scotland have been warned to be vigilant and report any sightings. McGinley's appearance and identifying information have been circulated to help public awareness. The victims McGinley harmed decades ago must now live with the knowledge that their attacker is unaccounted for and possibly dangerous to others. The system's failure to maintain supervision has re-victimized them by creating new anxiety and fear. McGinley's case demonstrates how release conditions are only as effective as the enforcement mechanisms behind them. When someone determined to evade supervision chooses to flee, the practical ability to prevent reoffending becomes limited. From an Irish fugitive to a Kentucky case that would spark different kinds of controversy. Ernest Pine. In August 2024, Ernest Pine was released on parole in Kentucky after serving just 17 years of a 20-year sentence. The 75-year-old had been convicted of heinous acts against his neighbor, crimes that left his victim with lasting physical and psychological scars. Pine lived near his victim, Elena Sanchez Hawkins, in a Kentucky neighborhood where they were familiar with each other. Pine was married and would walk his dogs past Hawkins's residence regularly, creating a false sense of normalcy before his attack. What happened in 2007? In 2007, Pine attacked Elena Sanchez Hawkins in a horrific assault that would nearly end her life. The attack occurred in circumstances that demonstrated premeditation and extreme malice. Pine harmed Hawkins in multiple ways before attempting to end her life by cutting her throat. The vicious nature of the attack suggested Pine intended to ensure she couldn't survive to identify him. Remarkably, Hawkins played dead during the attack, remaining motionless even as Pine inflicted terrible injuries. Her quick thinking and courage likely saved her life, as Pine apparently believed he had succeeded in ending it. The knife wounds were severe, requiring extensive medical treatment. Hawkins survived the throat cutting through a combination of her own actions and rapid medical response once she was able to call for help after Pine left. How did the case proceed? Pine was apprehended and faced trial for the attack. Rather than face a jury, Pine chose to plead guilty to the charges against him. On June 17, 2009, Pine entered his guilty plea to charges including attempted ending and other serious offenses. The plea meant he accepted responsibility, though his later behavior would raise questions about genuine remorse. Pine received a 20-year sentence for his crimes against Hawkins. The sentence reflected the severity of the attack and the lasting harm he caused. Did Pine's case have other connections? Investigators noted similarities between Pine's attack on Hawkins and an unsolved 1992 case, though he was never charged in that earlier matter. The parallels suggested Pine might have been responsible for other crimes that remained officially unresolved. The 1992 case involved similar methods and circumstances, raising questions about whether Pine had been attacking people for decades before finally being caught and convicted. However, without sufficient evidence to charge him, those potential connections remained speculative. How did he gain early release? Pine participated in Bible study programs while incarcerated, earning good behavior credits that reduced his time served. The religious programming allowed him to demonstrate rehabilitation to prison authorities. The good behavior system is designed to incentivize positive conduct during incarceration, but critics argue it should not apply to the most serious, violent crimes. Pine's early release after serving 17 of 20 years meant he was freed before his full sentence was complete. How did the victim's family respond? Elena Sanchez Hawkins's husband, Sam, spoke about the release, describing the attack as a very heinous crime. The family felt betrayed by a system that allowed Pine to walk free, while Elena continued living with the consequences of his actions. Sam Hawkins provided interviews to Wave News expressing the family's opposition to Pine's release. He emphasized that Elena had survived to see justice done, only to have that justice undermined by early release. Elena herself has become an advocate for victims' rights, speaking about her survival and the lasting impact of Pine's attack. Her willingness to share her story has helped others understand the reality of violent crime from a survivor's perspective. The Crime Junkie podcast featured Elena's story in an episode titled "Surviving Ernest Pine," bringing national attention to the case and Pine's early release. The coverage emphasized Elena's resilience and questioned the wisdom of releasing Pine. What conditions govern his parole? Pine is prohibited from having any contact with Elena Sanchez Hawkins or her family as a condition of his parole. Geographic restrictions also limit where he can live and travel. He must report regularly to parole officers and comply with monitoring designed to ensure he doesn't pose danger to the community. Any violation of these conditions could result in his return to custody to serve the remaining years of his sentence. What is his current status? As of 2026, Ernest Pine remains on parole in Kentucky, living under supervision somewhere in the state. His advanced age of 75+ may factor into assessments of his risk level, though his history demonstrates past capacity for extreme harm. Elena Sanchez Hawkins continues to live with the physical and emotional scars of Pine's 2007 attack. The fact that her attacker is free after serving only 17 years represents ongoing trauma for her and her family. The case raises questions about whether early release mechanisms adequately account for the lasting impact on victims. While Pine may have demonstrated good behavior in prison, his victim continues suffering consequences that will never end. Pine's release also highlights how Bible study and religious programming can be manipulated by inmates seeking early release, regardless of whether genuine transformation has occurred. The system assumes good faith participation indicates rehabilitation, but victims and their advocates often disagree, from Bible study credits to gang-related cases that capture different public attention. Gary the Hyena McGee. Gary McGee, known as the Hyena in Northern Irish criminal circles, was released from prison in early 2024 after serving time for ending a life through arson. However, just weeks later, McGee was back behind bars after breaching his license conditions. McGee earned his Hyena nickname through his proximity to deaths over his 30-year criminal career, amassing over 115 convictions. His extensive record demonstrated a lifetime committed to crime. What was McGee's criminal history? McGee's 115+ convictions spanned 3 decades, involving primarily substance dealing and related activities. He had built a reputation in Northern Ireland's criminal underworld as someone who wielded influence through dealing. His nickname, the Hyena, suggested a predatory nature and connection to violence, though specific details about earlier convictions remain limited in public records. The extensive number of convictions indicated someone who had spent most of his adult life involved in criminal enterprises. What ending was he convicted of? In May 2021, McGee committed arson that ended the life of Jimmy Thompson. McGee started 3 separate fires, demonstrating deliberate intent rather than accidental ignition. The multiple fire-starting locations confirmed. This was an intentional act designed to cause maximum damage. Arson investigators determined the pattern was inconsistent with accidental causes. The motivation for ending Thompson's life through arson remained unclear in public reporting. Whether it related to gang business, personal dispute, Oregon. Whether criminal matters was not definitively established. What was his sentence? McGee was convicted of manslaughter rather than the more serious charge in Thompson's ending. The lesser charge may have reflected questions about intent or plea negotiations. He received a 7-year sentence, which many felt was insufficient, given that his actions had ended a life. Northern Ireland's sentencing guidelines apparently allowed for this relatively brief term. Under the sentencing structure, Magee served approximately half his sentence before becoming eligible for release. This meant he was back on the streets after roughly 3 to 4 years for ending Thompson's life. What was his behavior in prison? While incarcerated, Magee reportedly boasted about how he had manipulated the courts, showing no genuine remorse for his crimes. His bragging suggested he viewed his sentence as a victory rather than appropriate punishment. The boasting indicated Magee had no intention of genuine rehabilitation. Rather than reflecting on the life he had taken or his decades of criminal activity, he appeared proud of gaming the system. What happened after his 2025 release? Magee was released in 2025 with license conditions governing his freedom. These conditions were designed to monitor his activities and prevent return to criminal behavior. Reports suggested Magee was attempting to move in on the empire of a fallen substance boss shortly after his release. Rather than going straight, he apparently saw opportunity in another criminal's downfall. However, Magee breached his license conditions in 2026, violating the terms of his supervised release. The specific nature of the breach wasn't detailed publicly, but was serious enough to warrant revocation. What is his current status? As of 2026, Gary the Hyena Magee is back in jail after his license was revoked for the breach. The brief period of freedom demonstrated he hadn't changed despite time served. Gardaí in Ireland were reportedly prepared to recommend that Magee and others be monitored as low-level criminals, though the breach and return to custody complicated any such plans. Magee's case exemplifies the challenge of managing career criminals who have spent decades in the lifestyle. With 115-plus convictions and 30 years of criminal activity, genuine rehabilitation may be unrealistic for someone so embedded in the underworld. His quick return to custody after release suggests that the license conditions were appropriate and supervision was effective in detecting violations. However, it also demonstrates that some individuals cannot or will not change regardless of consequences. The hyena moniker proved apt. Magee circled back to criminal activity almost immediately after tasting freedom, unable or unwilling to pursue legitimate life. His story serves as a reminder that prison time alone doesn't transform everyone. From career criminals to artists whose legal troubles intersected with their music careers. Max B. In July 2024, Charlie Wingate, known professionally as Max B., was released from New Jersey prison after serving 16 years. The Harlem rapper's sentence had been reduced from 75 years to 20, through a plea deal that acknowledged issues with his original conviction. Born May 21, 1978, in Harlem's housing projects, Max B. was raised by his grandparents after his mother struggled with difficulties that prevented her from caring for him. His mother, Sharon, and his upbringing in the projects shaped his early life and eventual music career. What was Max B.'s crime? In 2006, Max B. was involved in an armed robbery in New Jersey that resulted in someone's ending. The robbery had been planned, though Max B. did not personally carry out the ending. Max B.'s stepbrother, Kevin Leardom, was among the co-defendants in the case, adding family dimensions to the criminal proceedings. The involvement of family members complicated the case and Max B.'s position. The robbery targeted David Taylor, who was ended during the incident. While the plan was robbery, the situation escalated to someone being shot during a struggle. Forensic evidence showed the gun discharged during a struggle, raising questions about whether the ending was intentional or accidental. This ambiguity would play a role in later plea negotiations. What was his original conviction? Max B. was convicted in 2009 on multiple charges including conspiracy and involvement in the robbery ending. The conviction came despite Max B. maintaining he wasn't the shooter. He received a shocking 75-year sentence, effectively a life term for someone in their 30s. The severity of the sentence sparked immediate appeals and advocacy for reconsideration. Co-defendant testimony played a role in Max B's conviction, with others involved providing statements about his participation. The extent of his actual role versus what others claimed remained disputed. How did his sentence get reduced? In 2016, Max B accepted a plea deal that reduced his sentence to 20 years, acknowledging some responsibility while disputing aspects of the original conviction. The deal recognized that the 75-year sentence was disproportionate. The plea represented a compromise where Max B admitted involvement in the robbery conspiracy, while maintaining he didn't intend for anyone to be ended. Prosecutors accepted this middle ground rather than fighting endless appeals. What impact did incarceration have on his music? Max B had been building a music career before his incarceration, with his unique melodic rap style influencing many who came after. His phrase "wavy" became part of hip-hop lexicon, and artists from French Montana to Kanye West referenced his influence. During his 16 years in prison, Max B's music took on cult status among fans who felt his artistry had been cut short unjustly. The Free Max B movement gained celebrity support as his case became symbolic of harsh sentencing. Max B gave interviews from prison, including to Hip Hop DX in 2009 and All Hype Hop in 2012, maintaining his perspective on the case. These interviews kept his story alive in hip-hop circles. What did he say about the case? Max B acknowledged the loss, stating that was messed up, about the ending that occurred during the robbery. While accepting some responsibility through his plea, he expressed regret about the outcome. His statements walked a line between acknowledging participation in the robbery and maintaining he didn't intend or cause the fatal shooting. This nuanced position reflected the complexity of conspiracy charges where all participants bear responsibility. What happened upon his release? Max B was released on November 9, 2025, after 16 years behind bars. The release came after serving most of his reduced 20-year sentence, with good behavior credits allowing for earlier exit. Fans and fellow artists celebrated his release, viewing it as vindication that the original 75-year sentence had been unjust. His first day out was documented, showing Max B reuniting with family and beginning to rebuild his life. What is he doing now? As of 2026, Max B is free and working on releasing new music, picking up the career that was interrupted by his incarceration. Industry figures have expressed interest in working with him, given his influence during his absence. The question remains whether Max B can recapture the momentum he had before prison Oregon. If 16 years has changed both him and the music landscape too much. His wavy style influenced a generation, but audiences have evolved. Max B's case represents debates about proportionate sentencing and how the justice system handles those involved in crimes where intent and direct participation are murky. The reduction from 75 to 20 years acknowledged that the original sentence didn't fit his actual role. Another rapper would face similar circumstances involving gang charges and early release. YFN Lucci. On July 26, 2024, Atlanta rapper YFN Lucci, Rayshawn Bennett, was released from prison after serving nearly 4 years of a 10-year sentence. The release came after Lucci pleaded guilty to gang-related charges in a case that had captivated Atlanta's hip-hop community. Born February 16, 1991, in Atlanta, Rayshawn Bennett is of African-American and Jamaican descent. He grew up listening to Ty and Jeezy, showing musical talent by age 16. YFN Lucci has 4 children and a brother who goes by YFNK. His romantic relationship with Reginae Carter, daughter of Lil Wayne, brought additional media attention to his personal life. What were the charges against YFN Lucci? In 2020, YFN Lucci was named in a racketeering indictment related to gang activity in Atlanta. The charges involved alleged membership in a Bloods faction and participation in gang-related activities. Specifically, prosecutors alleged YFN Lucci was involved in a 2020 shooting that resulted in someone's ending, along with RICO charges that encompassed a pattern of gang behavior. The case painted a picture of street activities beyond his music career. How did the case unfold? YFN Lucci turned himself in to authorities in January 2021 after being named in the indictment. His voluntary surrender showed cooperation with the process, even as he maintained positions on the charges. An alleged 911 call surfaced that prosecutors connected to the case, adding to the evidence against him. The audio became part of the public narrative around his legal troubles. In May 2021, a manhunt was conducted after YFN Lucci's location became unclear during proceedings. However, he was located and returned to custody without incident. What was his plea deal? On January 23, 2024, YFN Lucci pleaded guilty to one gang charge, accepting responsibility for violating Georgia's gang laws. The plea came after years of legal wrangling and the prospect of facing trial on more serious charges. He received a 10-year sentence with time to be served in prison, followed by probation. The structure meant he would serve several years behind bars and then face an extended period of supervised release. The plea deal allowed YFN Lucci to avoid trial on the more serious charges, including the alleged involvement in the 2020 ending. By accepting the gang charge, he sidestepped potential life imprisonment if convicted on all counts. How much time did he actually serve? YFN Lucci was released on January 31, 2025, after serving approximately 3.5 to 4 years. His time served included the period from his 2021 surrender through his 2024 plea and sentencing. Credit for time served while awaiting trial, combined with good behavior, allowed his release years before the 10-year term would have expired. The remainder of his sentence converts to supervised probation. How did he describe his music style? YFN Lucci characterized his approach by saying, "If I can't rap it, I sing it," describing his melodic rap style. This versatility helped him build a following in Atlanta's competitive hip-hop scene. In a 2016 interview with Noisy, he discussed his music and influences, showing the artistic side that existed alongside the street life that would eventually lead to legal troubles. What has he done since release? As of 2026, YFN Lucci is free and has released new music, attempting to revive his career after the years-long legal saga. A 2025 album dropped shortly after his release. This was all from our side today. Thanks for watching. Click here to check out another video.